Next was the most difficult God Wars dungeon boss added back in RS2. She was by far the most profitable and difficult boss at release, dropping new best in slot armor sets for every style, and the new powerful Virtus Wand and Zaryte Bow. The Torva plate body, from the melee armor set, fetched over 600 mil after release. The Pernix body, from the range set, fetched over 800 mil. Nex required the best items available and large teams in order to take her down. Completely unsoloable for months after release, Zeitgeist has decided to incorporate Nex into old school RuneScape. This is an update I have been begging for. I did a ton of Nex back in the day, so I have some hopefully useful insight into how I think the boss will work in old school. How does accessing Nex work? Nex is going to be located behind the frozen door in the God Wars dungeon. Originally, this required collecting fragments of a frozen key from killing monsters from each faction in the God Wars, which would shatter after 5 uses and require collecting more key pieces. They stated in the news post that this would instead be unlocked from a mini quest, so I assume it would just be a permanent key gained after the quest or something. Likely still going to be killing monsters in the God Wars dungeon for the mini quest. Nex requires kill count just like any other boss. She will almost certainly be the most difficult KC to obtain of the dungeon, as there were no weak monsters to kill for it back in RS2. Also, they stated in the news post it will consist of spiritual creatures and blood reavers, and neither of these are easy. Ecumenical keys are going to work for Nex, so those are almost 100% going to be preferable to getting KC. I would definitely recommend collecting some before release, as it is going to be awful trying to get them. To all the PKers out there, sharpen your pitchforks. A lot of wealthy PVMers are going to be in the Wilderness God Wars dungeon. Some of you may remember the Ancient Ceremonial Robes set, which allowed you to access Nex without getting KC. Jagex will be adding this set, but it will not allow you to bypass KC. It's practically just cosmetic monk robes. In RS2, Nex had a bank right before the door to her chamber. They mentioned the same NPC, Ashulot Rays or something, however you pronounce that, who was in the news post guarding the door. But they did not mention a bank whatsoever, so I think we can expect to see no banker sitting there. The ghost likely will just be a death reclaim NPC like Torfin for Vorkath. Make sure if you die at Nex and end up running back that you take Ancient Protection. I can see this being another Hydra Day of Release scandal where everyone loses all their gear to stupidity. Nex is a combination of the Great Olm from Chambers and Nightmare. The old school team pulled many mechanics for these bosses from Nex's old design. Nightmare is actually based on Nex Angel of Death, which is basically Nex 2 from RuneScape 3. Go figure. Nex is Zeros' general, so naturally she represents a spell from the ancient spellbook with each phase. In order, the phases were Smoke, Shadow, Blood, Ice, and there was one final phase in which Nex activated Turmoil and Soul Split, draining stats and healing from damage dealt. She had the old school equivalent of 3000 health. Her powerful auto melee attacks had a max hit of 36, and many of her special attacks hit over 70. What gear did people use for Nex? People mainly used ranged, although this changed a bit as they updated the boss. Her shadow phase requires you to be very far away to avoid the constant damage ticks, so a long-ranged weapon would be very useful. I could see something like the Bofa being ideal for this phase. I doubt Jagex would make a twisted bow good at Nex, as it is already so good in so many locations. I expect her to have a lower magic level, although that would be a little strange as she primarily attacks with magic. I'm sure they'll figure out some way to make twisted bow bad. She was updated roughly a year after release to randomly prey deflect ranged on any phase. This protects her from range damage and deflects part of it back at the attacker. If they reincorporate this, then a melee switch will also be needed. It was very common to use a chaotic rapier for the fight, which is almost exactly the same as the Grazi rapier in old school. The scythe shouldn't work at Nex, as she is relatively small at a 2x2 size, giving it only 2 hit splats instead of 3. I would expect the rapier at least to see some use at Nex. I also fully expect to see heavy DPS special attacks like Claws and Chally make use in the fight for the Blood phase. Claws saw a lot of use in RS2. In the news post, they stated Nex would be vulnerable to crossbows. In the fight, only her mages were weak to crossbows, so maybe that's going to be the case? Crossbows are relatively awful in old school. Even the Zaryte Crossbow they were adding will not be exceptional DPS. The only way I see these being actually useful at Nex is if she has some kind of damage reduction against everything but crossbows, or something like that. Or maybe having a higher bolt effect proc chance against her, who knows. I also fully expect her to have similar defense mechanics to Nightmare, where she either can't be drained at all like with a Dragon Warhammer, or can be drained but only to a cap of a certain level with it resetting each phase. Like with Nightmare, you could hit her down to 120 defense from 150 and it would stop there. Let's get into how the fight worked in general. Nex generally throughout the fight uses a magic attack that hits everyone in the room. Nex also chose a tank based off their ranged defense to attack with melee attacks, very similar to Nightmare. These melee attacks hit very hard, but only hit a single target. This often meant it was optimal to stand within melee range of Nex wherever possible. People in chat would type MD to indicate that this was ideal. The fight involved at first lowering Nex's HP to a threshold, where the bodyguard associated with that phase became vulnerable. There were 4 of these bodyguards total, 1 in each corner of the room. Think Nightmare's pillars, it's a very similar mechanic. The bodyguard for that phase needed to be killed before the next phase would begin. Nex's various special attacks would always be used in the same order, and often after a certain amount of attacks on each phase, similar to Verzik's phase 3. Her first phase was the smoke phase. Nex used a smoke rush attack that poisons everyone in the room. Sandfew serums will likely see a lot of use for this phase. Her first special attack of the phase was the virus. Nex shouts, "Let the virus flow through you," and targets a player to become infected. This drains that person's stats and prayer and damage them, as well as spreading to adjacent players, resetting its decay timer if you spread it. Huh, that sounds familiar. Oh yeah, that's Olm's burn attack, just verbatim. Her next special for this phase I call is the dash attack. We actually saw a gif of this on the news post. Nex shouts, "There is no escape," and rapidly dashes across the room, heavily damaging anyone in her way. If she was attacked while dashing, the damage was completely nullified. This is almost the exact same attack as Nightmare's Surge special attack in her third phase. Her final special attack was a drag, where she grabbed a random player and dragged them to her melee distance, disabling their prayers and stunning them in place for a few seconds. After she is damaged enough, her bodyguard in the northwestern corner must be killed before progressing to the Shadow phase. For her Shadow phase, Nex used a Shadow Rush attack that drains prayer points if it hits successfully. This magic attack actually counted as ranged damage, so this is the one phase where you'd pray ranged instead of magic. Her first special is the exact same as Nightmare's Grasping Claws. Nex shouts, "Fear the Shadow," and shadows appeared under every player in the arena, damaging you if you didn't move out of the way in time. For her next special attack, Nex shouts, "Embrace Darkness," making the room darker the closer you are to Nex. Kind of similar to Zamorak's encampment. If within melee range, you would get a chat message stating the darkness begins to consume you. This would make you start taking constant damage, wearing off only if out of her range for 10 to 15 seconds. Her ground shadows also accompanied this special attack. When damaged enough, the bodyguard in the northeastern corner of the room became vulnerable. After that bodyguard was killed, the blood phase would start. This phase is what I think will make it incredibly hard to kill Nex solo or even in small groups. Nex used Blood Blitz auto attacks for this phase, which directly healed her for damage dealt, similar to P2 Verzik after 35% health. Her first special for this phase was Blood Siphon. Nex would shout, "A Siphon will solve this," summoning 2 Blood Reavers with a short delay. If you attacked Nex at all at this point, she would heal for 100% of the damage dealt. These Reavers also rapidly heal Nex until they are killed. For her next special, Nex would shout, "I demand a blood sacrifice," selecting a random person in the arena and turning them the color red. If the targeted player didn't run away from Nex at least 7 tiles, she would sap 10% of that person's HP and heal for 10 times the amount of damage dealt. This special also cut all the other players' prayer points by half, similar to Olm prayer orbs. In general, for this phase, you wanted to keep your prayer points relatively low. When damaged enough, her bodyguard in the southeast of the room became vulnerable. Nex actually continued to use specials and heal, and she often healed quite a bit before the next phase started, which just carried over that health, meaning you had to often do like 2 phases worth of health for the next phase. I fully expect Claws and Chally specs to see a lot of use during this phase. Nex's final magic phase is the Ice phase. Her auto attacks this time froze you in place, if not prayed against, and drained prayer with each hit. It was very common to get smited and frozen in place. Her first and probably most iconic special of the entire fight is her Ice Prison attack. Nex would shout, "Die now," in a prison of ice. This selected a random player to be trapped and stunned in a square of icicles, instantly disabling their prayers. If not freed by the other players, by attacking the icicles and being let out, it would take 60 to 80 damage. Her auto attacks also continued while the player was trapped without prayer on, meaning if not freed, they typically were instantly killed. This attack is extremely similar to Olm's Firewall. For her other special attack for this phase, Nex would shout, "Contain this," blasting icicles diagonally out from herself. Getting hit by these would hit you roughly a 35 and freeze you in place, as well as disabling your prayers. Once damaged enough, the final bodyguard in the southwest of the room became vulnerable. After this final bodyguard was killed, Nex's final phase began. This phase has no special attacks, but increased the effectiveness of all her regular attacks, buffing her max hit across the board. She would immediately heal roughly 1/6 of her health, and activate the Ancient Curse's Turmoil and Soul Split. I'm really hoping we see this happen in Old School, that would be so cool. Turmoil made her attacks drain your stats with each successful hit, in turn transferring those stats to Nex, similar to the bats in Inferno. Soul Split is an overhead prayer that made Nex heal for damage dealt. She also randomly would activate Deflect Melee, which not only blocks all melee damage, but also had a chance of reflecting the damage back at the attacker. She could also randomly activate Deflect Magic or Ranged, but this was relatively rarer. Her melee attacks now targeted anyone in front of her in a 3x3 square. A lot of times the tank would use a Staff of Light special attack just to negate some of the massive amount of melee damage. Finally, when Nex was taken down, she would shout, "Taste my wrath," exploding in a huge area around herself for massive damage before finally being defeated. Nex, when killed, would drop loot to the player that dealt the most damage. In Old School, this is going to be different. Everyone is going to get their own drop like with Nightmare. I assume there's going to be some kind of MVP mechanic for whoever did the most damage, who will get more loot or a better chance at the rare or something like that. The room could only be left by teleporting out or dying. I expect this to exist in Old School and encourage setups that get many kills a trip. Her most common drop was a huge pile of Sarah Brews and Restore. Roughly 1/3 of her kills dropped these. If that drop exists, it will make longer trips very possible. Her main big ticket drop in Old School, I think, is going to be any Torva Armour piece. Torva Armour will consist of a helmet, chest plate, and legs, each piece having a dramatic strength bonus increase over bandos and face guard for a total of +8 strength increases, along with higher defense stats over bandos. Each armor piece will require bandos armor to be shredded in order to create it. The body requires 3 components, legs 2 components, and helmet 1 component, with the shredded bandos chestplate providing 3 bandos components and chassis 2. All of these are going to be tradable. The bandos components will be broken, and repaired Torva will also both be tradable. I doubt this will dramatically increase the price of bandos like we've seen from the market, but it should at least help keep it at the price it was at. Torva is going to be incredibly powerful everywhere, providing a big max hit to Scythe. Not only will Torva obviously be best anywhere you were using bandos, I expect it to replace Inquisitors in many places as the new best option. I expect Torva to be best in slot for challenge mode raids, at Calphite Queen, and at Cerberus, all places where Inquisitors was best before. I also expect it to be incredibly valuable and her best drop. Next also will drop Zaryte Vambraces, the new best in slot ranged gloves with a range strength bonus of +2. These aren't going to be her best drop, but they definitely will be sought after. She also will be able to drop the Zaryte Crossbow, the new best crossbow with a ranged attack bonus of +110. It will have a unique passive of increasing the effectiveness of bolt procs by 10%. For example, increasing Ruby Bolt's damage to 110 from 100. It also will have a special attack requiring 75% spec energy that will guarantee a bolt proc if the attack lands. I could see this having use for unique speedruns for the near guaranteed Ruby proc special attack, or for Nex herself. As I said, she will be weak to crossbows. Although I don't see it generally being powerful anywhere, to be honest. I'm actually kind of underwhelmed by this crossbow, and hope they adjust it a bit after release if it is weak. Finally, she will drop the Ancient Godsword hilt, and this is the only reward I voted no to. It will have a special attack requiring 50% of your spec meter, attacking a single target with double accuracy and 10% extra damage. If the target does not move more than 5 tiles away and 8 ticks, it will hit the target for a 25 and heal you for that same amount. I find this to be really underwhelming, especially from a boss of this magnitude. It's designed as a PvP spec weapon, and I don't see it getting any use at any PvM encounter, as the SGS is always going to be better on average. I wouldn't mind Nex dropping a Godsword, but the spec definitely could use a rework in my opinion. If this does pass, I expect it to be her least valuable drop. Nex also will be able to drop something called a Blood Essence, which can be activated while crafting blood runes, increasing the amount of runes you get by 50% until it runs out of charges, allowing 1,000 additional runes to be crafted before it is depleted. You'll also be able to stack multiple of these, so you won't have to bank for more. This is a great idea that helps curb the cost of blood runes. And that's about it for my thoughts on Nex. Please let me know in the comments what you expect to see from Nex. I'm incredibly excited for this release. Leave a like if you liked it, and/or subscribe. Thanks, guys.